All right, everyone seems to be funneling in. If you were in the last session, I hope you found it insightful. I really enjoyed the discussion between the panelists. I thought it was very, very interesting to hear each of their perspectives. Um, and yeah, really excited for this session, which is titled Getting Ready for Change, Dealing with Visa Timeline and Fee Changes. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today for Chargeback X and this session. My name is John Carlo from the marketing team at Just, and I'll be helping with moderating today's session. I'm thrilled to welcome our speaker for today, and we'll be handing the microphone over in just a moment. But everyone, please welcome Kimberly Singleton, Director of Product Management at Worldpay. With more than a decade in payments, she began her career as a chargeback advisor and has since built a deep expertise in disputes and chargeback management, leading to her current role designing innovative dispute resolution products. Before we jump in, I just have a few quick housekeeping notes. We will be hosting a dedicated Q&A session at the end, so as we go, please feel free to submit your questions using the dedicated Q&A section in your webinar interface. If you are watching from the lobby, we encourage you to join the session so you can submit your questions. There is a Q&A icon with a little question mark chat bubble that can be used for this. Please do not use the chat. Please try to keep questions into the Q&A as much as possible. And yeah, we'll be keeping an eye on those. So we'll try to make sure we get to as many as possible during that final segment. So feel free to add in questions as you have them. And my last note is that this session is being recorded and will be shared with participants after the virtual event has ended. So if you happen to miss something, no worries there. And yeah, without further ado, I will pass the microphone over to Kimberly. The floor is yours.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me today. Thank you, John Carlo, for the introduction. So as stated, today we're going to talk about getting ready for change, dealing with visa timeline and fee changes. But I'm not just going to talk about visa here, right? I don't just want to have this discussion in a bubble. We're going to talk about all the networks and the fees associated with them, but we will dive a little bit more into visa as those are a little more recent and updates to that. And go ahead and head to the next slide. So as I stated, here's our discussion outline. I'm going to break this out in two sections, right? I want to talk about the problem that we're facing today with these rising fees, and then some solutions that you can consider to help fight or mitigate these fees. So the problem, we've talked about the scheme fees, the recent rises in fees, and some of those pain points in dealing with the rising fees and mitigating them. And then the solutions, we'll cover reducing chargebacks, right? First and foremost. Some pre-dispute solutions. We've got some inquiry products out there, and then pre-dispute solutions that are focused more on alerts. We'll talk about some post-dispute solutions, and then we'll get into the meat of how you handle any chargebacks after we talk about avoiding them with other solutions in the market. So we could move on to the next. First and foremost, we'll cover the problem that I just covered. So dispute scheme fees, the reason for this conversation, right? Recently, back in April, Visa introduced some pretty significant fee changes, right? And those fee changes were focused on motivating merchants to respond to chargebacks quickly, right? And really within 10 days. If you wanted to avoid a fee or keep your fee the same as it is now, you had a 10-day window. Otherwise, we saw some pretty significant increases in fees, specifically those who allow chargebacks to expire, right? Maybe you are going to accept it, but you don't want to make the effort, so you just let the case expire at day 30. Those fees have now gone from $3 to $7, so pretty high rise in fees there. The other one to talk about is MasterCard, and I didn't want to leave them off the table because while they didn't announce any recent changes, they do have a different approach to fees that we also want to consider as we talk about these solutions. Their approach was not to get a quicker response, but to get a more effective response. So, right, merchants in a MasterCard world, you face a $15 pre-arbitration fee if you accept a pre-arb after representing. So what MasterCard's trying to do here is say, make sure that when you represent, you're confident in your representment, because if you get a pre-arb and you accept it, that means you weren't that confident in your representment and you should have just accepted the chargeback to begin with. And we're going to penalize you for that. And that's that $15 fee. The other thing they do is they introduce direct filing for specific reason codes. Again, trying to force effectiveness of dispute responses. So think about your auth related and your EMV related reason codes, 4808, 4870, and 4871. MasterCard has a little rule in there that says if you represent and the issuer feels that your representment was not sufficient to address those reason codes, they can direct file arbitration. And we all know with those arbitration filings, if you lose, it's a pretty high fee, $500 plus in arbitration fees that can occur there. So they're pushing for effectiveness and making sure you are very confident in your representment response. Otherwise, they're going to send you some additional fees. Whereas Visa wants to resolve the dispute process more quickly. I'm not saying they aren't focused on effectiveness, and some of their dispute flows do push for that when you think about your auth and fraud related dispute flows under allocation. But now they're also pushing to get it done quickly. Let's pull down this timeline. And if any of you remember, like BCR, initially when Visa introduced the Visa claims resolution process, they were going to shorten timeframes even more, and they got some significant pushback. So you can see them now trying to do that, but within fees. So moving on from the fees, let's talk about the pain points now that have come out of managing these rising fees. We've got to respond quickly, right? But not only do we need to respond quickly, we need to make sure that response is effective, and we have a short window to do that. And that becomes hard to manage because we know we've got to look for a lot of places to respond to a chargeback, right? Look at the transaction, look at your CRM, get the documentation together. It's not always something that can be done within 10 days, or if it can, you really have to have a dedicated chargeback team to manage that. And then if you're looking on the other scale of it, and you're like, how do I just avoid it altogether? It's pretty overwhelming, right? There's a lot of options in the markets, a lot of things to do. Which one do you pick? Which one's effective? Which one makes sure you'd reduce the fees? There's a lot that you have to consider when you consider these rising fees and how you reduce them. So now let's turn over and talk about some of the solutions I've pulled together and the options that go with each of them. So when we think about solutions, the first thing I want to cover is reducing and resolving chargebacks. That's a straightforward answer, right? How do we resolve fees? Don't get a chargeback. So let's talk about methods in which we can reduce that. Then we're going to cover some of the pre-dispute solutions out there that will help you mitigate chargebacks and what those mean for you and the associated fees. And then we'll talk about dispute acceptance and dispute response. So first, let's cover our reduce and resolve. If we can go to the next slide. So let's look at ways that we can reduce disputes altogether, right? And some of these may seem obvious, but I still want to cover them and help drive them home. The number one reason merchants receive chargebacks is fraud, right? We all know fraud's the highest volume of chargebacks. How do we reduce fraud? One of the big things out there is having a fraud tool, right? You can do other things. You can put other things in place to reduce fraud. Make sure you're doing the proper verification on, CBV or ABS or, those types of validations. But having a strong fraud tool will really help you in that regard. So make sure you're doing some kind of measure to prevent fraud first and foremost. The other thing I like to advise, and this seems silly, but billing descriptors, right? There are so many merchants who come and say after they talk to their customer, they realize that they raised the chargeback because they didn't understand the descriptor on their statement. We've all experienced it, right? We look at our statement, we're like, what is this merchant? I don't remember shopping there. Who is this? Right? And that's because there's not a clear and concise descriptor. And sometimes it drives cardholders to immediately raise a chargeback. I don't recognize this. I'm raising a fraud chargeback. I never shopped here. Make sure your descriptors are clear and concise to avoid those chargebacks that, are just misunderstandings. The other big one, refund, return, and cancellation policies. Always, always have these clear and accessible to your customers, right? With the Amazons of the world out there with easy return policies and refund policies, merchants need to compete with that and consumers expect them to do so. So make sure that your refund and return policies are well stated and easy for consumers to address and utilize, right? Make returns easy. Cancellations. Like if you're a subscription merchant, make sure the cancellation process is easy. And there are, issuers and banks are also trying to support this by providing cancellations right within the application for your bank. So make sure you make that easy, because if they can't cancel or find a way to cancel, they're going to raise a chargeback, right? You didn't give me a way to cancel. I'm just going to raise a chargeback. So make sure that's available for your consumers and it's easy for them to access and understand. And then finally, know your customer, right? You have, use CRM details, use verification methods to make sure this isn't a friendly fraud scenario, that a child isn't getting on their mom's account and purchasing something. Do some things out there to make sure that you're avoiding some of those friendly fraud aspects. So there's some of those, there's more, right? I would always recommend to look at your chargeback volume, right? What is your most common reason code? Um, and how do you address that, right? I've done some big high level ones that always come to mind for me to help avoid chargebacks, but get more granular. Look at what's happening with your business to understand what maybe you need to do to stop those chargebacks from happening. Those answers that I put out there may not be the solution, but there are solutions. I promise you that. Okay, so next we're going to talk about some pre-dispute solutions, some inquiry products, right? We know we've got Order Insights powered by Verified Visa and Consumer Clarity powered by Ethica and MasterCard. So what are the features of these products? Why use them? The number one reason, right? Chargeback prevention. The goal of these products is to provide consumers and issuers with additional details on the transaction to make sure that the consumer recognizes it, understands it, and then hopefully avoids filing that chargeback. So when you think about that, that means that you can reduce chargebacks, you can reduce some of that friendly fraud by providing that detail. And the other aspect of Order Insights only is a guaranteed protection from 10.4 disputes. So Visa, probably about a year and a half, 2 years ago now, introduced CE 3.0, which is their way to mitigate friendly fraud. And that's by providing additional details for those, online transactions, those card not present transactions where it's a little easier for the consumer to raise a fraudulent chargeback. Visa's way to mitigate that was say, give us some extra detail to help us confirm that this cardholder did indeed conduct this transaction. And that's through their CE 3.0 data, IP address, device data, things of that nature. If you can send those via Order Insights, then you can block a chargeback before it ever happens. So there's some benefits here. The biggest one is giving more clarity to issuers and cardholders to hopefully avoid the chargeback. If we can go to the next slide. So that's all, well and dandy. Great, we can avoid a chargeback, but there are some things to consider when we look at these products. One, volume, right? Do you have the volume to warrant a product like this? Right? Do you have a heavy chargeback volume that you really need to reduce things quickly, avoid the loss and the cost to your business, specifically when you consider some of that fraud volume? We talked about data, right? These products are driven on data. Make sure you have the data that makes them valuable, data that you can share via these APIs, right? Do you have robust transaction data? If you get an inquiry, can you match it quickly? Because this has to be turned around in seconds. Can you match it quickly to a transaction within your system and provide all the associated data required? Right? One of the things as I've talked to other merchants about these products is they struggle. You're multi-acquired and maybe you get an ARN from one acquirer, but not from the other. So you're struggling to find associated transaction data because you don't have it across your whole breadth of business. So something to look at before you start going down this path. The other thing is we hear API, we know that means development and costs, right? So do you have the development resources to code to this API? It's not a quick process, right? It's not necessarily something you're going to get done in weeks. This could take months to ensure that as you're coding to Order Insights and Consumer Clarity, you're doing it effectively with the right resources. And the other thing is these products aren't free. So, right, we want to reduce fees, and they will if you use them effectively, but they still have their own fee associated with them. Now, Consumer Clarity and OI is really based on a per inquiry fee, and it's minimal in the scheme of things. But the other thing to consider is if you're really using this for that CE 3.0 protection, it has its own fee, right? And it's a percentage-based fee for block disputes. So if you're providing that data and you're blocking dispute, make sure you're aware that every time that one's blocked, a percentage of that transaction that's blocked is part of the fees here. So kind of weighing the costs, right, to the value of this. So all things to consider before you move down the path of order insights or consumer clarity. We can go to the next one. So now we're going to cover some of these pre-dispute solutions that are more of the alert products. So those were inquiry products. You get an API call, you respond quickly with some additional details to hopefully block the chargeback. Let's talk about these pre-dispute solutions that are about receiving an alert. And that's Consumer Dispute Resolution Network powered by Visa and Verify, and then Ethica Alerts powered by MasterCard Ethica. So one of the biggest thing about these products is because they're alert-based, they're trying to guarantee that they block a chargeback by initiating a refund. So I'm sure many of you have experienced where you've refunded a card holder and yet the chargeback still comes in, and now you've got to fight the chargeback with the refund details. And really, the chargeback shouldn't have happened to begin with because the refund was keyed. Or alternatively, you refunded it, received a chargeback, maybe didn't respond to that chargeback in time, and now you're out the funds twice, right? And that's a big pain point. So one of the points of these products is to say, we're going to give you an alert. This issuer is likely to raise a chargeback, but if you refund it now, we will guarantee that chargeback never gets raised, right? So that's the big thing here. So the other thing with these products is if you're delivering physical goods, right, can you prevent order fulfillment by getting these alerts earlier, right? So you can maybe ensure that you don't lose a product as well as a transaction. So you can refund to avoid a chargeback and potentially prevent order fulfillment and refund to avoid chargeback and loss of goods. The other thing it does here, think about those chargeback programs that each of the networks have. Can you resolve the transaction and dispute before it happens, therefore reducing your transaction to chargeback ratio? And Order Insights, touts the same. If we can go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about the merchant considerations with these products. Again, there's a fee associated. There's always a fee. And these fees can be a little bit higher, $15 or more, depending. Sometimes it looks at merchant risk, what's your MCC, things of that nature. Now, Visa and Verify have gone to more of a flat rate model. Ethica, I think, is still in flux. So look at what those fees might be and how it compares to your chargeback costs. The other thing, like I said, do you sell physical goods? Some of the merchants I've talked to with these products, one of the biggest benefits for them is stopping the shipment of goods, right? It's not necessarily getting that alert, reducing chargebacks. While that's a nice benefit, it's also retaining the goods before they lose them and then also receive a chargeback. So can you use this product to stop fulfillment, connect those two together? Are you in the MasterCard excessive chargeback program? The biggest thing for Ethica that the reason a lot of merchants sign up for this product is to get out of the MasterCard excessive chargeback program. So something to consider there. This is a big product in the market that should help you reduce that chargeback volume, therefore getting you out of the program. The other thing I want you to consider is capacity. These are not like a sit and forget product like Order Insights or Consumer Clarity, where it's an API call going back and forth and nobody's managing it. Right? You have to do some maintenance after you create the API, but it's not something that people are physically looking at. Ethical alerts and CDRN require you to review the alert and take action. That's capacity, maybe the same capacity that you'd use to respond to chargebacks. And on top of that, response must occur within 72 hours. So instead of that 30 or 45-day timeline, now you're working against a 72-hour timeline. So make sure you have the resources available to review the alerts, find the associated transaction, initiate a refund if you think it should occur, and then respond to the alert with those refund details. It is not necessarily a quick process. So something I want everybody to consider as they're looking at these, make sure you have the manpower or the ability to introduce automation for these types of products. And the other thing I advise too, when you think about these products, is not to just blindly refund every single one. Review them. Maybe the risk of chargeback is worth it. There are trends out there now that issuers are as much as merchants get savvy, issuers get savvy, right? So if they are initiating Ethica alerts and they notice every single time this merchant always refunds a transaction, they're going to be more likely to initiate the chargebacks against you instead of fighting it internally. So something to consider. If it warrants a refund or you think that's the best approach, absolutely do it. But don't just do it for every single one if that's not the right approach, because I promise you, others are noticing these trends and building AI and machine learning against it, just like the merchant side. Okay, next we're going to talk about the one post-dispute solution out there, which is rapid dispute resolution powered by Verify and Visa. So RDR features and impact. What's the purpose of RDR? In my mind, there's one purpose, and that's to resolve the dispute and avoid the chargeback. There is no ability to review and provide additional transaction details or stop the fulfillment of goods, right? RDR is when the issuer is already raising the chargeback. And what the merchant can do here is have controlled rules to say, if the issuer is raising a chargeback and it meets this criteria that I've set, I will essentially accept that chargeback. And I think some of the confusion with merchants and this product in the market is that they don't think it's a chargeback, but that's exactly how it comes in as, right? Issuers raising it, it has this rule set as they're initiating the chargeback. So it comes in as an RDR chargeback. While I say chargeback, the biggest caveat to this is that it does not count against your transaction to chargeback ratios for Visa. If a chargeback is resolved via RDR rules, it does not go against your counts. So that's why my biggest push for merchants to use this product is if they need to quickly get off a Visa Excessive program, which is now VAMP, which I believe is a session later today, if you're interested in learning more about that. Biggest benefit here, right? And some may be, and I'll cover one other option in the next slide that you may want to consider with RDR. So, like I said, use primarily if you're in the VAMP program and you need to get off quickly. And I say quickly, right? If you're trending and you're going to get some excessive fees, use this. You'll start reducing. If you do a blanket RDR accept or a pretty high one that covers all your fraud disputes, you can get your ratios down quickly. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't look at other things I've discussed earlier to reduce the chargebacks to begin with. Because if you have a chargeback problem, RDR is not really solving that, right? It's putting a Band-Aid on a bigger issue. But it does help you get out of those dispute ratios quickly. And it is something you can adjust over time, right? So when you think about this product, it doesn't mean you set rules and they always stay that way. Let's say you say every 10.4 chargeback that comes in, I want to go down the RDR path. And that will reduce my dispute volume by 75%. Great, gets you out quickly. But then I would advise you to start looking at why you're getting so many 10.4 disputes. Start resolving those and then come back and adjust your RDR rules. You can do a little bit at a time to see what makes sense to still keep you below the ratios, but maybe not accepting as many because you feel like perhaps you have the right to start finding more. Maybe you've got some C 3.0 data, things like that. The other thing I consider here, and sometimes I recommend to merchants, is perhaps it's a method to get your or your chargeback fees a little bit lower, right? In some cases, your chargeback fee may exceed your RDR fee. And one of the rules that Visa set forth was to say acquirers cannot charge merchants for RDR chargebacks the same they charge for regular chargebacks, your standard chargeback. So I can say, at Worldpay, if a merchant signs up for RDR outside of Worldpay, we don't charge them a fee for that chargeback at all. Now that's a Worldpay rule. I'm not saying all acquirers do the same. Maybe they charge you a lesser fee. Visa was a little bit broad in how they presented that, but essentially they said you can't charge them the same as you do for a chargeback. If you get charged a $25 chargeback fee, you cannot charge $25 for an RDR, but maybe they charge 50 cents. Something to look at and understand, but let's say your chargeback fee is $25 and you're always accepting chargebacks. Perhaps RDR is the right process to just reduce that fee to $15 because the acquirer doesn't charge you a chargeback fee. It's playing the game a little bit, but something to consider, especially if you're in the business of maybe blanket accepting certain chargeback scenarios for Visa, maybe a quick way to blanket accept but get a lesser fee. I don't recommend blanket accepting, by the way, but if that is your process, it's one thing that you can look at. We can go on to the next slide. Okay, so I talked about how to avoid chargebacks, how to use some inquiry products for pre-dispute, the post-dispute product of RDR. Now let's talk about those chargebacks that make it through this flow. Some best practices for dispute management. There's always this question of, do I accept or do I respond? And we know with Visa, acceptance within 10 days gets you a zero extra fee, right? So some things, these seem obvious, but some things to consider. Does the cost to fight the chargeback exceed the dispute amount? How much is the chargeback? Is it $5? Is my, person's time working this chargeback really gonna make a change with a $5 dispute? Do I just accept those? Especially if that's a fraud chargeback, that's $5. That's probably not worth fighting, right? Let's focus on those ones we know we can win. And that's where it comes to, a valid cardholder claim. Does the cardholder have a valid claim, right? And we always want to absolutely say like, no, they don't. But sometimes they do, right? So consider that. Perhaps they did return the goods and they have proof of that and it was a miss, or perhaps it truly was a fraudster who got through. Things to look at before fighting, and that does mean reviewing each chargeback, which is cumbersome, I know. And then the other thing is to look at reason code and win probability. We know those fraud and auth related disputes require a lot of data to fight those chargebacks, right? Did you get an authorization? Did you meet the fraud requirements, right? Can you legitimately fight those with the data on hand? And then a lot of acquirers and providers also look at the likelihood of winning the dispute, right? What's our history on winning this type of chargeback? What's our probability? Do we have an 80% probability of winning this? Then fight it. Do we have a 5%? Maybe not so much. Things to consider. We'll go on to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about best practices for accepting chargebacks. Again, this goes back to that Visa fee you accept earlier. You get a smaller fee or no fee at all. But that doesn't mean we should blanket accept. So I would look at stringent acceptance criteria. Consider all aspects of the dispute. Consider the dollar amount, consider the merchant, right? If you have multiple mids within your portfolio as one more high risk. Consider reason code, things of that nature. Don't just blanket accept. I have many merchants who just say, we accept all chargebacks. We don't feel like fighting them. I don't think that's the right approach, right? Not all chargebacks are valid. Let's try to get money back where we can. Timeliness is key. I keep hammering that home. The earlier, the better for Visa. So the earlier you accept, the lesser the fees. So one thing to consider there is, can you put automation in place? Now, again, I don't recommend a set and forget rule, but maybe it's automation for every $5 chargeback or under for 10.4 or 4837 or, UA01, whatever the reason code may be by network. Those are ones that maybe you can just say, I'm always going to accept these because it's just not worth my effort to fight these. Let's put some automation in place, get that accepted quickly, reduce my fees on Visa, and reduce the noise with all the chargebacks I have. So some things to consider if your acquirer or other provider supports it. Look at considering automation for some of acceptance. That way you can just get them out of the way and focus on the disputes you need to respond to. So now let's talk about best practices for responding to chargebacks. Capacity is a big thing. I hear merchants say it all the time, right? I do not have the staff to manage the amount of chargebacks I receive. And I know that's a pain point, right? That's hard, but if you don't have the capacity, then put some things in place. Like I said, automation for acceptance, focus on disputes you know you can win, focus on reason codes you know you can win, things of that nature. But capacity is big, right? Make sure you have the capacity to manage it and to manage it quickly. And it's not just about capacity, right? It's about having that knowledge, right? And just ensure you have the expertise. All the networks publish their dispute rules, understand them, read them, reference them, responding to a chargeback. If you just respond saying, this is invalid, this cardholder came here, this consumer came here, they bought the goods, this isn't right. I get it, right? But that's not evidence, right? Focus on the reason code for the dispute and what the networks say you need to provide to win. Otherwise, you're just kind of getting angry and not really making any movement on the chargeback. The other thing to consider is making sure you always have that supporting documentation and data, right? We know fraud and auth is all about the data. Do you have it? Can you provide it? Can you prove your case? And if it's supporting documentation, can you provide things like proof of delivery, right? Can you provide things like they signed these terms and conditions? Make sure you have easy access to that data to support your chargeback response. And then If you don't have the above, if the above is difficult, if capacity or dispute knowledge or supporting data is too much, consider looking at a provider. Right? There are many providers out there who can help you with this, who do have the staff and the expertise and the way to gather the documentation so you don't have to. So we can go on to the next slide because I'm going to talk a little bit about providers and what to consider with solutions for those. So many providers, and you can move on to the next one. When we think about outsourcing chargeback management, why would you do that, right? And I just kind of covered a little bit at that in the earlier slide. But big one, resources. You don't have the capacity for the chargeback volume coming in to effectively and efficiently manage your chargebacks, right? Maybe you can throw a bunch of responses out there, but they're not sticking, right? And you still have a pretty high lose rate, right? Win versus loss. Maybe you're responding to 80%, but you're only winning 5%. You're not being very effective. Something to consider when you look at your data. The AI and machine learning benefits that come out of a provider. Many providers use AI and machine learning to help build that chargeback rebuttal. And I think that's key, right? Human error and bias can cause a problem in chargeback handling, and there's been some lawsuits out there associated with things of that nature. So when you're looking at providers, one of the things to ask is, what's building this rebuttal? Is it a person out there gathering screenshots, or is it more of a machine learning AI-based model? Because you reduce risk when you go down that path. It also helps with effectiveness of chargeback responses, right? These things learn over time, and they will adjust your response to help boost your win rate. They see what works, what doesn't, adjust accordingly. And so with those types of models, you expect your win rate to go up. And that's where I'm talking about the increased win rate. The other thing with these providers is they kind of put their money where their mouth is, right? Many of them do a success-based fee model, right? So they're saying, I am so confident in my product that you're only going to pay for what I win. If I lose, you don't pay anything, right? And so then it's mutually beneficial. You both want to win. And so it gives them a little more momentum to make the product successful. And so one of the things you need to look at here when you're looking at a success-based model is just making sure you're doing the financials properly. Look at all your chargebacks coming in. What are you winning today and recovering total in dollar amount versus what the provider is promising? Maybe they're promising that they can have a 50% win rate, but they're going to keep 25% of that win amount. Which one's higher? Perhaps your, 20% win rate actually gets you more in your pocket than their 50% win rate because of what they're consuming. But the other aspect of that is looking at the capacity, right? You can reduce OpEx with these types of models. So make sure you're factoring that in when you look at a provider in a success-based fee model. Don't just look at the dollar amount, look at your OpEx. Can resources be focused elsewhere to help the business instead of just managing chargebacks? And then the other thing that will be key, and especially when we're, in this topic right here, is the win rate improvement strategy. So I heard Ronan reference this earlier, that they have come up with a model to help manage these visa fees, right? Because we know that responding on day 25, even with a provider, is going to get you a higher fee than responding on day 9. So can we look at things like winnability scoring to focus on efforts on high probability disputes and then auto accepting the rest? So you win what you know you can win, accept everything else in order to reduce fees. So kind of looking at a hybrid approach and not just blanket responding to everything or blanket accepting. So those are things I would ask when you look at providers, right? Are they AI, machine learning? Do they do a success-based fee model? Do they have winnability scoring? Can they auto accept on your behalf for those that don't meet that criteria? Things of that nature to make sure you're getting a provider that's most effective. All right, so we're going to leave, I think, about 10 minutes for Q&A. So in conclusion, understand your chargeback rules, keep up to date with all the chargeback rules. They are ever changing. Visa and MasterCard, Discover, Amex, they all change them. They update twice a year, April and October, so make sure you're staying close to those. They don't always introduce new chargeback rules, but just something to be aware of. Leverage the right dispute tools for your business. Look at pre and post dispute tools to prevent chargebacks or resolve them efficiently, right? What makes sense for you? Is it order insights? Is it Ethica alerts? Because you can get that, you can stop the shipment of goods and issue a refund. Or do you rather, code to an API, get that out quickly, no hands on deck kind of approach? Um, Implement some best practices, right? Look at your dispute volume, what's working, what isn't, how do you adjust your approach? And then potentially, if it makes sense for your business, choose the right provider, right? Look at the problem in your business and find a provider that can help solve for that problem, which also makes sense financially. And with that, that concludes my presentation. So, Giancarlo, if we want to open it up for some questions in the chat.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Kimberly. Honestly, some really insightful things were mentioned in that presentation. So great job. Kudos to you. Thank you for sharing your perspective, your insights, your strategies. That will help hopefully the audience members in navigating some of these changes and just chargebacks in general and moving forward. So yeah, I will sort of open the floor for Q&A. We do have about 9 minutes that we can handle Q&A, and we do have some open questions, which is really exciting. I also see a few questions in the chat. If possible, please try to submit your questions into the dedicated Q&A box within the Zoom interface. If you are in the lobby, you will have to join the session uh, to do so because it's a feature as part of Zoom. But without further ado, let's get started. So, Kim, when will the Visa fee increase start taking effect?
Yeah, so that actually went into effect in April. I think some merchants are just now feeling the pain of it or experiencing the pain, but they did introduce that in their April compliance. I think it was April 1st of this year that fee went into effect.
Nice. Cool. That was probably the shortest question we have. Let's move on. This individual said, our website is easy to access, to cancel, but what can we drive the customers to actually contact us to cancel or go to the website versus creating the chargeback and then we have no call or even see them canceling? It's just an ongoing sub.
That's a difficult one. I mean, if you're making it easy to cancel and consumers are still taking the easy route, and I wouldn't even say it's an easy route to raise a chargeback, right? It seems easier to cancel than to call your issuing bank and raise a chargeback. So I don't know how else you shove it in their face if you want to cancel. I don't know if it's an email to say, hey, your subscription's renewing, cancel here, maybe a link on emails. I mean, I didn't even realize I subscribed. I'm one of those. It was a yearly subscription, and they came through and they did send me an email and say your subscription's about to renew. What I found painful with the email is they didn't give me a way to cancel within it. If you'd like to cancel, please. And I know we don't always want to make it easy to cancel, right? That impacts our bottom line. But if they're just going to cancel anyways, let's make it easy. And so then I had to go down a path of searching for some kind of cancellation process and eventually had to chat with somebody in order to get it canceled. So it was painful. So maybe consider some other ways to just get it in front of them before the subscription renews, besides just having it on your website if it's an email or a text message alert, something along those lines.
Yeah, that's a great response. I think definitely some good tips in there. This individual also said, my other question would be, we provide everything we need to support our chargeback and we end up losing. Sometimes we feel as if our evidence is not being read and we get those fees. What can we do to prevent our evidence from being dismissed and actually get the bank to review it accurately?
Um, I think this is a problem on both sides. You know, we know that a lot of times at an issuer, it's somebody sitting there pressing some buttons, right? And we feel the same pain point on the merchant side. One of the things that we've noticed is that certain issuers prefer data in different orders, and that's hard, right? And that's where I talk about some of the AI and machine learning coming into play, because some just want it quick and concise. You may provide pages of documentation and they're just not going to flip through them, right? It's too much to read. And so they move on and like, I'm not shuffling through this documentation. So sometimes I recommend a summary, a quick, concise point, and then provide your supporting documentation. Other issuers prefer a lot of documentation. So it's a really hard thing to answer. If you aren't risk adverse, there's always the opportunity to, again, make issuers put money where their mouth is, right? If you think you're very confident in your rebuttal, take it further, right? Don't just stop at representment. Respond to the pre-arb. Take it to arbitration. If you truly feel you have all the documentation that the network requires to respond to a chargeback, make the issuer go to arb, right? Maybe that's the right answer, and maybe try it out a couple of times, see what your success is, and maybe that will stop some trends from happening with specific issuers who maybe aren't reading the documentation fully.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing the insights. Another question here. How is WorldPay passing on increased penalties from 0.5% to 2.2% to its merchants?
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't really address this question. I'm not part of the VAMP team and the penalties. It is something that you can address if you're a WorldPay merchant, address with your relationship manager. We can get you to the right answers for that one.
Gotcha. Thank you. Can a merchant use compelling evidence found via OSINT techniques / social media to dispute? They provided an example, which is friendly fraud evidence found via social media that the consumer indeed received the product. Can this be used for compelling evidence in disputes from merchants?
Um, Unfortunately not, right? And that's frustrating, right? You go on to their social media website, hey, they used it, but that's not evidence per the networks, right? When we talk about true compelling evidence, you've got to capture things like the device data, the IP address, locations, things of that nature that really support the rebuttal. It's got to be cold hard data, and not just a social media post, which you can't even validate the person on social media. That's one aspect there. Like it could be anybody who says they are Kimberly Singleton, but maybe it's really Bob, right? I don't know. And that's where, as much as that can be frustrating as a merchant, and you can submit it all you want and see what happens. And if it sticks with the issuer, it's not considered true compelling evidence by the schemes.
Good to know. Next question is, how do you feel the current chargeback system is set up in terms of power? Do merchants have an immediate disadvantage compared to issuers?
Um, no, I wouldn't say that. I think many issuers experience the pain of chargebacks just like merchants do. And if you think about for them, they're on the hook to provide that money to the cardholder if they lose. So there is that aspect as well. Where I think issuers may have an easier time in raising chargebacks is e-commerce, right? It is not difficult to raise a chargeback for card not present fraud strictly because you aren't capturing chip, right? You aren't necessarily always capturing all the data to block a chargeback from happening. It really doesn't even exist for e-commerce. And that's where I think they have a slight advantage with the chargeback space. Otherwise, it's really open to interpretation with the other reason codes. If it's something like a processing error duplicate, it's pretty straightforward, did not receive goods, things of that nature. I think either party has a right, an equal opportunity to win. I think, merchants face the most pain points when it comes to that card not present fraud because there is no straight answer to how to block those chargebacks from happening.
That's very interesting. So we do have 2 minutes remaining for this session. Kim, I don't know if you have anything after this and want to just like extend 5 minutes, but we can go maybe 5 more minutes after that. We do have some lingering questions here.
Yeah,
Um,
happy to answer.
cool. This one landed in the chat, but I think it's an important one to address. So the question is, it's a long one, so let me know if you need me to pause at any moment. But as an issuer, we continue to see acquirers / merchants that confuse ethical alerts and RDR, where the merchant issues a refund on top of the Visa funds movement for RDR. They process a pre-compliance instead of rejected the RDR in these scenarios. What are the best practices for acquirers / merchants for the differences between alerts and RDR?
Yeah, so this is a pretty big pain point. I think the first thing I want to address there is that you cannot reverse an RDR chargeback according to Visa rules. So if we, as an acquirer, receive an RDR chargeback, we do not have the rights to reverse it like we would any other chargeback. It is auto accepted, it is closed. We don't have rights to do anything else. So the only path that Visa has set forth for merchants to recoup funds in the case that they've issued a refund already is pre-compliance. So that's why you're seeing those raised. So that's per Visa rules, right? If I tried to reverse an RDR chargeback, I'd get a reject from Visa. They wouldn't let it happen. So we have to go down the pre-compliance path. And yes, the other thing to address is, and this, I've actually had quite a few conversations with Verify about this, about how we address it. But if a cardholder calls the merchant and says, I didn't, I returned this XYZ, this is fraud, and they issue a refund, but then they also go to their bank and raise a chargeback at the same time because they're so frustrated. Those two tend to cross paths, right? And so the RDR chargeback gets raised because the issuer hasn't seen the refund yet. And now the merchant's out twice. And they're out the refund and they're out the RDR chargeback. And that's a pretty big pain point. And it just comes down to a timing overlap. I know Verify is looking at ways to better address this quickly to avoid these chargebacks, but they haven't found it yet. And sometimes that's where I advise merchants, if you have RDR rules set up, pretty diligent about your refunds. It's not a great customer experience though either to say we're not going to give you a refund, raise a chargeback. It'll hit a rule. Um, but as far as an issuer receiving increased pre-compliance, it really comes down to that. That is the only method for merchants to recoup their funds if the case went down the RDR rails.
Nice. Yeah, that was really great. I think your perspective is really important there. Thank you. One more question here. In an e-commerce business, we have lost many cases in not providing a signature. Do you have any tips to winning these product not received case types?
So you're e-commerce and you're required to get a signature. That's interesting. Because signature, I mean, signature's not even a thing at all anymore, right? It's either chip or it's e-commerce, right? Where there is no chip. Um, so this seems old school. You're not going to ever collect enough transaction data unless it's C3.0 data to block the chargeback. And even then, if it's C3.0, you got to send it through Order Insights for it to be blocked, or it's not going to get blocked. But you can do as much as you can to ensure if you do get a chargeback, you can fight it with some compelling evidence. And those are things I've hammered on before. So I would advise going and looking at MasterCard has their own product in place. Visa has C3.0. Look at those rules, see what data elements they require in order to avoid, those friendly fraud chargebacks, essentially. Signatures never required, should never be required. It's not even a thing anymore. I always actually get frustrated when a merchant makes me sign something because I'm like, this does nothing. But it's chip, or you need to have the right transaction checks in place or capture the right data for an e-commerce transaction to avoid the chargeback. If it's product not received, I'm sorry, I think I missed that point a little bit. Product not received case types. Are we talking about like signature for delivery? That is a little different, and it's nuanced network by network. Discover's kind of big on that and requiring a signature for delivery. But that drives friction for the consumer, right? None of us want to sign for something we've received at the door, just drop it on my doorstep. So I think I would dive deeper into the dispute guides for this one, see what you can do to help avoid it. That's an interesting that you have so many of those for you as an e-commerce business that they're raising because you didn't sign for delivery. Very interesting. Sorry, I don't have a great answer for you except look at the dispute guide, see what we can do there.
All good. Cool. Well, I just wanted to say great job, Kimberly. Thank you for sharing your presentation, these insights, fielding the Q&As. It was a really, really awesome and insightful session. I'm going to close out now unless there's anything else you want to share on your end.
No, not at all. I appreciate everybody's time listening to me talk. I hope you found this beneficial, and feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you ever want to chat more about chargebacks.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you to everyone who has attended this session. We do have a upcoming session right after this one. It starts in about 10 minutes. It is titled, Are You Risk Loving or Risk Averse? And that session will kick off in 10 minutes. In order to get there, you will need to head out back to the lobby and click join session when that session begins. In the meantime, I will stick around here just to make sure that anybody who is still hanging out in this session is able to make their way over there. And again, I just want to say thanks, Kim. This was a really awesome session. Q&A was popping with great questions, and yeah,
Yeah,
hope
thank
you
you for having me.
hope you can join some other sessions too throughout the day.
Bye all.